Okay. So hopefully you've picked up the notes in the back, notes for session 4. So now that we have spent some time looking in detail at, we started off by looking at what are the suttas, what's the Visuddhimagga, that they're different, and then we went into some detail about not only how they lay out how Samadhi itself is understood, but then went into some detail about jhana in both systems. So now I want to bring it back to looking at, as you can see here, Samadhi in important Buddhist lists. These are, we could say, the most or among the most important practice-oriented suttas or lists. And we're going to look at 3 lists in particular today. One's called the 7 Factors of Enlightenment. One is one of the discourses, the suttas, called the Satipatthana Sutta. Very, very important. It gets emphasized a lot. And one is called the Anapanasati Sutta. Ana, in breathing and out breathing. It's mindfulness of breathing sutta. And we'll look at all 3 of these. We're mainly focusing on the aspect of Samadhi, how it relates to these. But we'll also spend a little time, because there'll be a range of experience, understanding of even what these lists are. So we'll take a little bit of looking in there, but I don't want to get too much away from the Samadhi part today. So we'll just start on page 1. And as it says there, Samadhi is prominent, or it's emphasized in many, many places in the suttas. Shows up in all kinds of lists. Jhana does, and Samadhi. So when we talk about Samadhi, we may or may not, the suttas may or may not be referring to jhana, right? One of the places, important places that Samadhi shows up is in the Eightfold Path. And the 8th and final element of the Eightfold Path is right concentration, right Samadhi. And it's defined explicitly, right concentration is explicitly defined as the 4 jhanas. So it's clear about that in the suttas. So you would think that in that system then, whenever it's talking about cultivating Samadhi or bringing some amount of Samadhi into any style of practice, you would think that the suttas mean right Samadhi, the 4 jhanas. You may, if given its prominence in the Eightfold Path, but that's not necessarily so clear. So we want to explore that a little bit. So we can, well, before we move on, I'll just say, because that may bring something up for some of you. If right Samadhi in the Eightfold Path is the 4 jhanas, then does that mean if you've got wrong Samadhi if you don't have jhana? So I'd just like to offer a way that I think is useful to think about it. It's true that the suttas do say right Samadhi. It doesn't say culminates in jhana. It says sama Samadhi, right Samadhi of the Eightfold Path, is the 4 jhanas. However, a more useful way to think about it is that right Samadhi culminates in the 4 jhanas. But I like to think of it as it's always right Samadhi, no matter where you're at, as long as it's informed by the other elements in the Eightfold Path, by right view, for example, right intention and all of these, then it's right Samadhi. And I think that creates less suffering, is more useful. Yeah. Anyway, so certainly that's an important place where Samadhi appears. And then I've listed a few others that we're not going to go into here. So for example, there's a list called the 4 Bases of Power, Itipada. Don't worry about what it is. We're just not even going to go there in this class, but you can look that up. What's known as the 5 Spiritual Faculties, which is there. And that same exact list is also given, sometimes called the 5 Strengths. It's considered 2 different lists. It's the same list with 2 names. And then I say it's also an element of the 7 factors of enlightenment. This list, the 7 factors of enlightenment, is, I think it would be hard to overstate its importance. And in fact, I've given you a quote here. And let me just read it for you here. It says, all those who escaped from the world, that's in the past, or escape now, or will escape in the future. So by escaping from the world, it just means full enlightenment, become arhants. So all those who escaped from the world, or escape, or will escape, did so, do so, and will do so, will continue to do so by, and then it just lists 3 things. Abandoning the 5 hindrances, which are defilements of mind that weaken wisdom. That's number 1. And number 2, with minds well established in the 4 establishings of mindfulness. That's the Satipatthana that we're going to look at. Number 3, by developing the 7 awakening factors thus present.
Richard, do you have that in quotes, that passage?
Yes.
That's from?
I can give you the, just a moment. Let me just give it to you offline, if you will. It appears, I have to look it up here, but it appears in, it's not just tucked off in one little corner in the suttas. It appears in, I think, say 5 or 6 different places. It's a stock passage. But so what that's telling us is that this system, Theravada Buddhism, is emphasizing this, and what it's really saying that the whole path to everything else, places that we'll talk about the path to enlightenment that don't mention it in these terms, but should be thought of in these terms. So it's 3 things. You have to set aside the hindrances. In other words, that makes sense enough to practice. And then you establish the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So what does that mean to establish them? And then you bring the 7 factors of enlightenment to fruition. Okay. So this list, the 7 factors of enlightenment, is very, very important. And, you have to, I think in most cases, you have to have some degree of samadhi in order to fulfill all 3 of these, to abandon the hindrances. You have to bring certainly some mindfulness, but some degree of, so attentiveness, but steadiness and presence, to have enough awareness, because what happens for most of us so much of the time as we just walk around in our daily lives, the hindrances may be up. Greed in the mind, sensual desire or aversion. We may not even see it, and we're just at the effect of it. So we need some degree of samadhi to do that. The question is how much. And then we'll look later this morning and into the afternoon about, well, how much do we need it for the 4 foundations of mindfulness? And what's the 7 factors of enlightenment talking about? How much? Is it saying we have to have jhana? Or just some amount of concentration? Yeah? Okay. By the way, we already know the answer in the Visuddhimagga. Remember, the Visuddhimagga has 2 paths of practice. I think we did this several months ago. There's what's called the path of samatha and vipassana. And samatha was the path of tranquility in which you attain jhana and then turn towards other kind of practices called insight meditation or vipassana. But there's a whole other path, which is what's called dry insight, in which it's a pure vipassana path, pure in the sense that you're not interested in jhana, and you don't, once you've attained jhana, you're not on the dry insight path anymore, whether you intended it or not. You're right, because and it's said that remember it was said that because you have not been moistened by the moisture of jhana, is what the texts say. Which it seems to me may come out of those jhana similes. You think, where does that, because dry is not a negative connotation. We talked about this, right? Yeah. So we know that you can have the path of dry insight in the Visuddhimagga, and they're explicit. So we're really more looking at, well, what are the suttas saying then here? Okay. And then I'm just giving some other quotes here at the bottom of page 1, just to give there's more, but this gives you a flavor of the importance of the 7 factors of enlightenment. So here's the first one. Just as all the rafters of a peaked house slant, slope, and incline towards the roof peak, so too when one develops and cultivates the 7 factors of enlightenment, he slants, slopes, and inclines toward Nibbana. That's a pretty explicit and strong statement. Here's another one. What is the path and the way leading to the cessation of craving? It is the 7 factors of enlightenment. I can give you the sutta references offline if you want to get those. I don't know why I just didn't put them in here. Okay. So let's turn to page 2. And at the bottom of page 2, there's the section, the 7 factors as path to jhana. So we'll get to how it relates to jhana in a few moments. But for now, let's just take a look just briefly at what the 7 factors of enlightenment, what that list is. So at the top of page 2 on the notes, I've listed them all here, and I've given you the Pali. But let's just go through them in English. This is the standard order that they're given in. Begins with the first of the 7 is mindfulness. The second one is, you could translate in a number of ways. I've said investigation or discrimination of dhammas, or discernment of Dhamma. Let's pause here for a moment. So remember that Dharma is the Sanskrit, Dhamma is the Pali. So we're just using the Pali here. And the word Dharma or Dhamma has more than one meaning. The way that it's commonly used, Dharma means the teachings. All of Buddhist teachings is the Dharma. I'm thinking that's the way that most of us are here at most of the time. Sometimes Dharma just means the truth or the way things are, if you will. And then there's also a very important meaning, which is what we're talking about here, is when they talk about dhammas or dharmas. It really means things. It's phenomena. But it doesn't mean things just in the ordinary everyday sense. It's actually on a more fundamental level, looking at the nature of, because you just think of dhammas as, we'll get into it more, but things, experiences that can arise can be dhammas. I'll just leave it at that. They're things, just experiences, phenomena. Yeah? Any comment about that question? Yeah? Okay, just a thumbs up and leave it at that. Phenomena.
Yeah, experience.
Yeah. So that's an important usage that doesn't get talked about necessarily so much in our here in the West in our scene. Okay. So what's happening? You investigate. Well, we'll come back and see what's happening. So there's mindfulness. It's called Dhammavichaya, investigation of dharmas or dhammas. Then number 3 is energy. Virya. Number 4, I've translated as rapture. That's the piti. Remember the jhana factor, piti. Number 5, tranquility. The word is passaddhi. And then number 6, concentration, samadhi. And then number 7, equanimity, which is upekkha. So, by the way, you can see that this quality of equanimity is going to is in some sense everything, no matter what list or style of practice, it flows to equanimity. So here it is. It's the 7th in this factor of the enlightenment factors. If you think of the 7 factors of enlightenment as a progression, we'll look at it in a moment about how you can approach this list. But if you think of it as a progression, it's the culmination of that progression of 7 elements or 7 steps. Equanimity. Remember back to the jhana definition, and especially when we got into the third jhana and the 4th jhana, the factor of equanimity comes to prominence and it's really highlighted more than anything. If you look at the 4 Brahma Viharas, the divine abodes, Metta, loving kindness, Karuna, compassion, Mudita, the sympathetic or altruistic joy or happiness. Number 4, equanimity. Yeah. Right. So you could think of a mind that's freed from craving. Remember back here on page 1, what is the path and the way that leads to the cessation of craving? Right? That's going back to the 4 Noble Truths. Remember, second Noble Truth is that what causes the clinging and the suffering is of the first Noble Truth. The second is craving or tanha, thirst. And the third Noble Truth is that there is an ending, nirodha is the word, a cessation of that craving. And then the 4th Noble Truth was the Eightfold Path. That's the path leading to the cessation of craving. Well, it's also saying here that the way that leads to the cessation of craving is the 7 factors of enlightenment. So even though it doesn't state this explicitly, it's really bringing those 2 together, right? It's really equating the Eightfold Path and the 7 factors of enlightenment. They're both the way to the cessation of craving. So equanimity is real important. So there are different ways that this list is approached. It is approached both as just a bare list of factors that are given, and it's sometimes thought of and taught as to be practiced and developed sequentially. And so we'll just look at both of those. If you look at it just as a bare list, the mindfulness is considered the balancing factor. And then there are 3 energizing factors, which are the next 3 in the list. The investigation, that has an energetic quality, your right? Discernment, investigation, an engaged quality of dhammas. And then there's energy, well, that's energizing, energy, so you bring, and then there's this piti, or this rapture or bliss. So that's the energizing. And then on the tranquilizing side, well, there is tranquility, right? A passaddhi. There's concentration, samadhi, and there's equanimity. So if we're not approaching it to be practiced sequentially, it's more a question of bringing awareness when certain factors are present or not present, when some are strong and some are weak. And we'll come back and look at this in a bit with the Satipatthana, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. It's actually real explicit in there in the 4th foundation about being aware of how these factors are arising. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I lost you. So are you saying that you suggest that it be developed sequentially? or not, or you're just giving both?
Right. I'm not suggesting one way or another that it should be developed sequentially or as a bare list. The way I think of it as when we're looking at the way we've been presenting the path of meditation practice, that we just continue practicing in that way. But part of it is as we gain some fluency or facility and we're familiarity with this list, we have awareness, because sometimes this can inform our practice. If one of the factors is weak, and we just can feel, or it's just our intuition that it needs to be strengthened, then we may choose to incline our mind to bring that factor up. And maybe it's just like you had said earlier, you know, sometimes you could set an intuition, not an intention to practice aiming towards the concentration of the inside. You're really looking to strengthen one or the other. Similarly here, you could incline your mind to bring different factors up. So with all of these, the more familiarity we have, the less we have to think it through and stir our mind up. In the moment when we're practicing it, there's just a nonverbal knowing of what's needed. And that comes for most people over time, where you know, some people just dive in and study the stuff and memorize it, and for others, it just comes over time. You become more familiar. So how you apply it depends on the person. So this as a bare list, and then you could look at it as to be developed sequentially. So let's just think about that for a moment. You would begin with mindfulness, number one on the list, and then using that mindfulness, apply yourself. This seems like pretty standard insight kind of language, right? You're bringing your attention to experience. In other words, you're investigating or bringing discrimination, discernment of phenomena of the Dhammas, right? Then by doing that, at number three, whether it naturally then brings up an energy because of the fact of applying yourself, or you choose to bring in more energy when it's needed, that just depends, but that would be number three. And then remember, at least in the jhana list, there was a phase where we, as a result of doing concentration practices, it gave rise to piti. It comes. And then as things settled more, or concentrated more, the piti settled out. And so going from number three to number four, there's that same, from number four, the piti, to number five, it settles out from a piti, which is more energetic, to a tranquility. So you could see it's a progression. And then the samadhi comes to prominence, the concentration itself, and then leads to an equanimity. So you can kind of see a progression here. A couple of the steps don't automatically, naturally flow one from the other, but you could it could be a natural progression, or you could, you know, just consciously choose it as a natural progression. Yes?
So would you say number 4 is an attainment of the first jhana?
Well, we're going to look at that in a bit. But let's just say that some people view the 7 factors of enlightenment really as, it's really talking about jhana. Others don't map it onto jhana at all, especially if you've been practicing in so many of the insight meditation traditions that are common, say, around here, where they're not talking about jhana so much. It's some degree of concentration, but it's very much not mapped onto jhana. I actually think it's both. What I'm going to argue is that when this comes to its culmination, it's jhana. But you know, we want to be aware of the 7 factors of enlightenment wherever we're at. Doesn't matter if we're in jhana or not. You can still have some piti and you're not in jhana, or a lot of piti. You can have samadhi and not be in jhana. All of these can be present, actually very strong, and not be in jhana. And they serve us very well and are important. Yeah. Okay. All right, so that's just the basics. Any question about it?
Richard, I'm sure maybe you said it, but do we know where these lists this came from, or in the canon, or?
Yeah, the 7 factors of enlightenment is all over in the Pali Suttas. When you say where they came from, and we don't know how the suttas developed. That's not what you're asking.
Kind of.
No, we don't. The origins of the suttas are unknown. Okay. So, at the bottom of page 2 then, now remember, yes?
Back to your last statement, the origins are unknown. I mean, there's the story of the first Buddhist council and all that. And how what
Oh, right.
what do you mean when you say that?
Right, what do I mean when I say, right, that was too crude of a way to put it. The details of the development and evolution of the suttas, we don't know. Yes, we have the standard accounts that are the historical accounts. And so it's true that, there was I don't think anybody doubts that there was this Siddhartha Gautama lived, and this man we call the Buddha, so we'll accept that as historically accurate. The main elements in the history is passed down, I think most people accept. There probably was really, I think scholars would say, some gathering called the First Council, and some of these main events, I think. But the details of how the suttas evolved.
So between the council and they're actually written in that period?
Right.
Okay.
Between the council and when they got written down is, you can try to trace some elements in there, because we see how did the Abhidharma come into being and how do the commentaries, and you can see an evolutionary path. Actually, if you're interested, I trace one of the evolutions in my book here in one of the appendices. No, it's not in the appendix, it's in the book, the last chapter on controversies. And you can, on controversies, I think it's in there. I talk about going from the suttas through the Visuddhimagga, and you can trace the evolution of nimitta. How is it talked about in the suttas, and then some of these early and later, all the way to the Visuddhimaggas, and you can see a progression. So you can kind of see some things occasionally.
Has anyone actually written on that, who's considered a scholar of the early days of the codification and all this stuff?
I'm not up to date on that so much, but I would say certainly there are people who've taken a look and tried to stratify different sections of the suttas and say, well, this is most certainly earlier, this is most certainly later, this is most certainly, and so, but I'm not sure how precise they can be with that. So, and it's just not my area of expertise. Yes. Oh, sorry, I think, yeah.
If you have all of the 7 factors present in a kind of rich sort of way, isn't that an awakening in itself, or a deliverance?
Yeah, so I'm just repeating for the video. You're asking if you have all the 7 factors of enlightenment present to a strong degree, isn't that an awakening? Well, no, most certainly. But there's different kinds of awakenings, so they can all be present, just like you can be in jhana. You can have all kinds of deep experiences, and in the moment there's a liberation, if you will. That would be viewed as not the same thing as the liberation that uproots the tendencies. That's more the long term what the path is. So in the moment, there's no question about it. It can feel like enlightenment, or
So would that maybe be stream entry?
No, I would not map stream entry onto, now different people may say something different, okay? But stream entry is not about any meditative states. So, it's not about having strong samadhi or anything. It's remember there's this list of what's called the 10 fetters. We won't go into it here. And the fetters are just eradicated. Think of fetters as tendencies of the mind to create suffering. I guess you could say it like that. So to be stream enterer, by definition, three of those fetters or those tendencies have been uprooted, whether you're in ordinary daily life consciousness or deep meditative consciousness. Those tendencies of the mind, defilements, if you will, have been uprooted. So I'm not mapping this onto the stages of enlightenment. We're going to do that next month. We're going to look and actually try to map all this onto the stages of enlightenment. The answer is, it doesn't, it kind of maps, kind of doesn't. All right, at the bottom, oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Your definitions are very exact, so I'm going to ask you to help me with one.
Yeah.
And it's taking me back to first grade here. Mindfulness.
Right. What's mindfulness? Right. I'll give you my definition, but keep in mind that mindfulness is defined in, there's a range of definitions. And I should also say that those definitions, as far as I can see, are roughly divided into two categories. There's the practice of mindfulness, and there's the state of being mindful. I call the state of being mindful, my definition is not being on automatic pilot. It's not very precise, but I think it captures it.
Very good.
I wish I could come up with something that wasn't as whimsical sounding, but I don't. But I think, to me, that captures it. So here's what I say at the bottom of page 2. Though there is no explicit reference to jhana in this list of the 7 factors, it can be viewed, I didn't say it is, but I said it can be viewed as a condensed summary of the step-by-step path leading up to the cultivation of right concentration. And I say, and the 4 jhanas. I don't know why I say, and right concentration is the 4 jhanas. So let's take a look here. This is important. If you look at the list of the 7 factors of enlightenment, they correlate directly to this, to the progressive development of jhana. And so turn up to the top of page 3. And this is a quote from the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses in this. There's a very, very long exposition, or it lays out the whole path from, leaving the household life and going into the homeless life, and how practice evolves all the way up through jhana and the full liberation. Yeah. So here's a passage, and you can see I've put certain pieces in bold here because they relate back to the 7 factors. So I'll just read it here. And when he knows, that one's in bold, that word, the word pasati, knows. Vipassana comes from this word pasati, to see. The vi is the prefix in the pasana, pasati, to see. When he knows that these 5 hindrances have left him, gladness arises in him. From gladness comes rapture, piti. From the rapture in his mind, his body is tranquilized. There's the tranquility that's in the 7 factors. With a tranquil body, he feels happiness. That's sukha. And with happiness, his mind is concentrated. There's the samadhi. And then it goes on. It begins, you can see right there, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, on and on. We're into the definition of the 1st jhana. So there's, okay, let's continue. The next paragraph, I point out that the 2nd jhana is characterized by rapture, that's the piti, and the pleasure born of concentration, there's the samadhi. And with the attainment of the 3rd jhana, you abide in equanimity. That's one of the 7 factors. Mindfulness is one, and clearly aware. And again, in the 4th jhana, purity of mindfulness and equanimity. And then finally, I've given you a passage here. This is attributed to the Buddha when he's talking about this time of meditation just before his enlightenment. Tireless energy, that's the virya, was aroused in me, and unrelenting mindfulness was established. My body was tranquil and untroubled. My mind concentrated and unified. And then he goes into the 4 jhanas. So, of those factors that I have in bold, 6 of those 7 are explicitly, they're directly in either the introductory passages to the jhana formulation or in the jhana formulation itself. So I think it's hard to get away from that certainly if we take the 7 factors of enlightenment, when they're well developed, I think, if you could say maybe to a culmination or deeply developed, that it just maps right onto jhana. Okay. And you don't even have to do that, because since samadhi is one of the 7 factors, and since the right samadhi is the 4 jhanas, I'm assuming that the suttas, when they talk about samadhi, at least taking it again to its culmination, it's talking about, its culmination, the 4 jhanas. So I think it's hard to divorce the 7 factors from the jhanas. But again, the important things from a practice point of view is, it's like I said earlier about right samadhi. You don't have to have jhana. We can say that the 7 factors are something we should be interested in and applying in our practice, regardless of whether you have jhana or not. But in its culmination, I think it's there. Yeah. Yeah, just one moment, yes.
This is going kind of back to the origin question. From the passage the Buddha recounts his practice, does this imply that, my basic thinking is that this whole system is kind of created by one person's experience. But if he refers to the jhanas, he says, I entered, I abided. These were already known states, and he was saying, I attained states that had been well known.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, but he, just because it's worded this way, it could be, I entered in this state. He's calling it, even if he coined the terms, even if they weren't thought of in this way, if people knew what he was talking about, then, even if he had established it, maybe years earlier, or even the day before in a talk he gave, then he could say, he could say, okay, today I'm teaching you something, and here it's new, and it's called the 4 jhanas, here what it is. The next day he could say, before my enlightenment, I entered in the 4 jhanas and refer to them as already known. So I don't know that we can infer from the way it's worded here that it was already known. However, I also think that there's no question that that powerful meditative states were known at his time. And these, and in fact, he practiced before his enlightenment with 2 teachers, and it says one of them took him up through the 4 jhanas and into, I'm trying to remember, the first 2 of the formless attainments, and then the next teacher he went through the 4 jhanas and up through even one more of the formless attainments. So these had to be known in some form or other at the time. Yeah. Whether they were called the jhanas or not, I don't know. Jhanas in the Pali, different from the Sanskrit too. So, yeah. Okay. Anyway, is that enough on the? Was there another? I'm sorry. Yes.
I did have a question. I wondered if you would mind commenting a little bit more, and I know we've covered it a bit. The term purity of mindfulness, and then juxtapositioning that a little bit to the Buddha's description in the next paragraph, unrelenting mindfulness.
Yeah. I'll give you my best, but this is just me. I'm qualifying everything because, purity of mindfulness and unrelenting mindfulness. Well, let's back up. So unrelenting mindfulness, that word unrelenting has an intensity to it, doesn't it? But there's certainly an experience, if you're in jhana. I have never personally used the word unrelenting before, but I would say it's unrelenting mindfulness, but I would tend to say it in a different way. When you're in jhana, mindfulness on its own, you're not doing anything to make it happen. It's doing you. Unbroken mindfulness. You could say unrelenting. It's just, as long as you're in that state, it's just there. The mind would never go off or won't even have a tendency to start. There can be other factors arising in your mind that we'll look at more next month. So it's not that other impulses can't come up, including the ability to actually incline your mind in different ways. But as far as losing that presence and just clarity and wakefulness, it's you could say unrelenting. That's how I take it. It's just unbroken. And in fact, I happen to like unbroken as I don't know the Pali words here. So maybe unrelenting was the sense that the Buddha meant it when these teachings were given. But what I like about unbroken is unrelenting to me has, there's a powerful feeling to something being unrelenting, and the sense of doing is in there, but I'm unrelenting. I'm unbroken. There doesn't have to even be a doer. It can just be happening. Anyway, so it's a different feeling. But anyway, that's how I take it. And then purity of mindfulness, well, if you go back to the jhana definitions there, I think what's happening there is it's talking about really in the, I think that was in the third jhana, where because, remember, the piti and the sukha can be very, very powerful even when you're not in jhana, before jhana. It can be real powerful. Some people, it can even be overwhelming, and you need to work to bring it down. Those settle out as you're getting, remember, first jhana, and even in the second jhana, you got piti and sukha, but the vitaka vichara has dropped away. And by the third jhana, the piti's gone, and it's talking about sukha. So there's a smoothing out that happens, or a settling. And the more as you go from the third to the fourth jhana, that things settle. What comes to the fore in your, experientially speaking, is just this clarity or purity of the mindfulness itself, the wakefulness of mind itself is what's prominent. And the equanimity is along with that. I think that's how I take it, just simple like that. Yeah.
In the second paragraph on the third page, you're referring to clear awareness. Is that sampajana?
Right. That's sampajana, yes. Okay. So, as we continue, so here's what we're going to leave the 7 factors now. We're going to take a lunch break. And when we come back, our next, we'll stick with the normal schedule. We'll have a 30-minute sit. When we have our teaching session, which is going to be a little longer, we have an hour and a half for that afternoon session. But it's a little ambitious because we want to look at both the Satipatthana Sutta and the Anapanasati Sutta. And so I just want to give you a heads up that I will take a few minutes just to name what the contents of it is. But each of those really is a lifetime of study and practice. And so I want to mostly stay focused. I think we can easily cover Samadhi, the Samadhi aspect. We may not be able to get off into a lot of the details of other aspects. Yeah. Okay.